Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 162, The Horden Family. Part 2. In this episode, I'll be covering Samuel and Jane Horden's children. The eldest child of Samuel and Jane Horden was Samuel Jr. He was born on the 24th of September 1876 in Paddington. He was educated at Sydney Grammar School and then Bath College, England. He married Charlotte Isabel Annie in 1900. Charlotte was the daughter of Sir John C., who was the Premier of New South Wales from 1901 to 1904. John C. was from England and he came with his parents in 1852. Their original surname was actually Seekings, but they changed this once they came to Australia. And they had 4 children together. On the 3rd of January 1919, it was announced that His Excellency the Governor has received a telegraphic despatch from the Secretary of State for the Colonies, intimating that His Majesty the King has been pleased to appoint Mr. Samuel Horden to be a Knight Bachelor. Samuel lives at Darling Point and has a country residence at Retford Park Barrel, where he has the best herd of Jerseys south of the line. He's very modest and very approachable. Sir Samuel is most popular in all circles. He is the youngest knight in the Commonwealth, except perhaps Sir Douglas Mawson, and it will be quite safe to say that there has never in Australia been a more popular knighthood than that which has been conferred upon Mr. Samuel Horden, young Sam as he was for many years called, to distinguish him from his late father. Sir Samuel died on the 3rd of June 1956 at the age of 79 at Paddington. And his death was announced in the paper. Sir Samuel Horden, well-known Sydney businessman and sportsman, and his eldest sister, Mrs. J.M. Dolly Hill, died within a few hours of each other today. Sir Samuel would have been 80 in September, but he had been ill at his Darling Point home for several weeks. Lady Horden died a few years ago. Sir Samuel managed and trained many racehorses. He was part owner of Artilleryman, which deadheaded with Richmond, Maine in the 1919 AJC Derby and won the Melbourne Cup in the same year. Sir Samuel entered the family business of Anthony Horden and Sons, the big Sydney department store, after he finished his education at Bath, England. He took control of the store when his father died and he managed it until it was sold in 1926. Besides being a director of the Commonwealth Bank and the New South Wales Perpetual Trustee Company, Sir Samuel was chairman of AMP and the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. So that leads me to their second child, Dolly, Janie Maud Horden, who was born in 1878 at the family home Retford Hall in Darling Point. She initially married Leslie Nicol Walford on the 5th of February 1902 in Sydney when she was 24 and Leslie 33. In the 1911 census, Janie was living in London with her and Leslie's daughter, Phyllis Horden Walford, who was born in 1904, and she had a nurse and 2 servants. On the 30th of April 1913, it announces the divorce of Leslie and Janie. Leslie Nicol Walford of independent means petitioned for a dissolution of his marriage with Janie Maud Walford, formerly Horden, on the ground of desertion. The suit was not contested. The petitioner said that his wife possessed an extraordinary temperament, and about 3 years after the marriage she went to England with her little girl, her mother suggesting at the last moment that her husband should not accompany her as arranged. He wrote frequently suggesting that they should live together again, and in 1908 went to London where he lived in the same house as the respondent. The petitioner returned to Australia early in 1909, his wife accompanying him as far as Port Said. He subsequently received a letter from her saying that she did not want to live with him. In July 1910 he received another letter and went to England where he saw his wife at her flat, she having telephoned an appointment. She asked the petitioner to go for a divorce, which he refused to do, and she then said, "If you don't, I shall go for one myself." The petitioner replied that if she did, he would fight it, and when she said that she would pay the costs if he would divorce her, he answered, "I think you've been unkind enough as it is without insulting me." That ended the interview, and in September 1910 the petitioner returned to Sydney. His wife refused to return to him, and he has not spoken to her since. His Honour granted a decree nisi, returnable in 6 months. Janie then went on to marry David John Jackson Hill in 1914 in Portsmouth, Hampshire, England, when she was 36. And as mentioned, Janie died on the same day as her brother Sir Samuel. She was 76. Their daughter Phyllis came to Australia in 1924 and married Rupert Wills Moses at Wallara in 1925 when she was 22 and Rupert 27. They had 4 children, 2 girls. Pamela and Prudence survived childhood. And in the Newcastle Sun on the 25th of October 1940, it announces her divorce. Moses versus Moses. Desertion by reason or her non-compliance with an order for restitution of conjugal rights was the grounds on which Rupert Will Moses, a grazier of Wandawat, Singleton, sought a divorce from his wife, Mrs. Phyllis Horden Moses of Bellevue Hill, Sydney. Moses said that he was married at St Mark's Church of England, Darling Point, on the 26th of February 1925. There were 2 children, girls, aged 15 and 10. On the 1st of May 1940, he was granted an order for restitution of conjugal rights against his wife in the Supreme Court of Sydney. He kept the homestead at Wandawoy, open for 21 days after June this year. The homestead, which was designed by his wife, was where they lived before they separated, and she did not return to him. A decree nisi was granted. Phyllis then went on to marry Henry Thomas Osmond, known as Harry, in April 1948 in Sydney. Harry was a doctor. And it says Mrs. David Hill entertained last night in honour of her daughter, formerly Mrs. Phyllis Moses, whose wedding to Dr. Harry Osmond was celebrated quietly at St Stephen's. Phyllis died on the 19th of May 1953, aged only 49. The third child of Samuel and Jane Horden was Harriet Horden, known as Etty, who was born on the 9th of August 1880 at Darling Point. She married George Ruding Gaydon on the 26th of July 1905 in Sydney, when she was 24 and George 29. And it says a large concourse of friends and spectators assembled at St James's Church on Wednesday afternoon, July 26, to witness the marriage of Etty Horden, daughter of Mr S. Horden of Retford Hall, Darling Point, with Mr George Ruding Gaydon, the son of T.B. Gaydon, Belvedere, Bayswater Road. George Gaydon died in Sydney on the 26th of October 1907. He was only 32 and it was only 2 years after their marriage. It says George Ruding Gaydon, solicitor, died at his residence Beaufort, Wallara, this morning of pneumonia. He was the second youngest son of Mr T.B. Gaydon of the Commercial Banking Company of Sydney. Harriet then went on to marry Paul Engelbert John Neuerborg, who was German, on the 4th of September 1909 in London, when she was 29 and Paul 33, and they had 1 son. Harriet died on the 31st of March 1945 in Brighton, East Sussex, England, aged 64. The fourth child of Samuel Horden was Minnie Sarah Horden, who was born on the 10th of August 1882 in Paddington, New South Wales. She married Colonel William Walker Russell Watson, who was a dental surgeon, on the 7th of November 1904 at St Mark's in Darling Point. She was 22 and William 29. They had no children, and William died in 1924, aged only 49. Minnie went on to marry Dr. H.V. Horden, who was the former googly bowler of the Australian 11 at Potts Point. Herbert was Edward Horton's son, so Herbert and Minnie were second cousins. Minnie died on the 15th of August 1931 at Wallara, aged only 49. The fifth child was John Booth Horden, who was born on the 15th of May 1884 at Wallara, and it says that in his father's will that he disinherited his son John Booth Horden and cut him off without even a proverbial shilling. John Horden died on the 16th of May 1969 at St Leonard's at the age of 85, and unfortunately I've been unable to find the reasoning behind why that decision was made. The sixth child was Priscilla Horden, known as Prissy, who was born at the family home on the 5th of March 1886 at Darling Point. She married Yule Oakert, who anglicised his name as John Olivier, in July 1907 at St Marylebone, London, when she was 21 and John 25. In the Australian Star in Sydney, it announced their marriage, and it said Oakert J. Olivier, third son of Mr G.C. Olivier of Olivier Towers, Outhshorn, Cape Colony, was married to Priscilla Horden, youngest daughter of S. Horden of Sydney. They had 1 son, Gerhardus Cornelius Horden Olivier, on the 10th of June 1909 in Brighton, Sussex, England, and Priscilla died on the 21st of April 1971 in Vancluse in Sydney. Their seventh child, Anthony Horden, was born on the 21st of February 1889 at the family home Retford Hall at Darling Point. In 1908, he was working in the London division of the family business, and he married Viola Sydney Bingham on the 27th of February 1911 at St Paul's Cathedral in Melbourne. They had 3 children and they lived at Retford Hall. And the announcement of Viola's death that occurred in London. She was the daughter of the late Colonel Bingham of Melbourne and at one time of the Indian Army. She leaves 3 children, a son and 2 daughters who are in London with their father. She was for a time interested in racing and entered horses at Randwick and was also a prominent exhibitor of cattle at the Royal Sydney Show. Mrs. Horden, whose home at Retford Hall, Darling Point, was very handsome and was very popular in society. A personal friend of the Honorary Mrs. Pitt Rivers, she was frequently at Admiralty House with Lord Forster when he was Governor-General of Australia. She was the president of the Women's Hospital in Crown Street. On the death of his wife Viola in 1932, he married Ursula Mary Bullmore at the All Saints Church of England Church in Wallara when he was 43 and Ursula 21. They had 2 children. Ursula was the fashion editor of the Australian Woman's Weekly from 1946 to 1957 and influenced noteworthy changes to the Milton Park landscape. In the 1950s, they built a round house designed by Guildford Bell at Point Piper. And Anthony Horden died at his apartment at Point Piper on the 18th of April 1970 at the age of 81. His estate was valued for probate at $985,048. Says he was one of the world's leading animal breeders, and he was one of Australia's best-known pastoralists. Anthony was educated at St Mark's Crescent Grammar School and in England at the Hitchin Grammar School at Hertfordshire and Worcester College at Oxford in 1907 and 1908. He then returned to Sydney to work in Anthony Horden's and also worked in the offices in London and New York. He sold his interest in the business in 1924. In 1915, he sailed for Egypt to assist the Australian Red Cross Commissioner Sir Adrian Knox. He was granted an honorary rank of Major in March 1917 and he went on to France. He was appointed CBE in 1918 and then returned to Australia in the December of 1919. And he was again a Red Cross Commissioner in World War II. In 1910, he bought rich land at Bowral and he built Milton Park, created a model farm with Shorthorn, Guernsey and later polled Hereford cattle and Romney Marsh sheep and established a famous garden. He leased Wilton Park near Picton where he continued breeding horses. He owned Bywong at Gundaroo where he established a stud flock of Lincoln sheep, and he also owned Mungadale at Hay where he improved the merino flock established by C.W. Simpson in 1865 with Bunnock merinos from Faulkner. He also later owned a property, Wingadale at Bowner and Ulladulla at Holbrook. All of his properties he made improvements and used his wealth to import the best stock. He was a council member of the New South Wales Sheepbreeders Association for nearly 50 years. He was a foundation chairman of the Guernsey Cattle Society of Australia and foundation president in 1931 of the Australian Pony Stud Book Society. He was vice president of the RAS from 1933 to 1958, a councillor for 44 years, and he chaired its cattle committee from 1938. He helped his brother Samuel to build up the show and, as a regular exhibitor, won many major prizes from horses and cattle. At Milton Park, he bred mandarin ducks, had native and exotic finches and parrots, and produced colours in budgerigars and canaries never before seen. In his youth, Horden was a keen polo player with his own team, the Wanderers, and provided mounts for the Ashton brothers for their first overseas tour. Later, he was president of the New South Wales Polo Association. He enjoyed racing speedboats, winning in 1912 and 1913 the Australian Speedboat Championships with his Kangaroo, and later big game fishing. His craft Seeker served with the Australian Navy in World War II. He belonged to the Union, Australian, New South Wales and Royal Automobile Clubs. He was affectionate and generous but hated publicity. He had an eye for animals which he loved, and his skill in their breeding and unfailing vision for future trends were his greatest strength. The 8th child of Samuel Horden was Libaeus Horden, known as Lib, and he was born on the 31st of May 1891 at the family home at Darling Point. In 1910, it was announced that Libaeus was missing. It says missing since the 26th of March last from the Rock Lily Hotel at Rock Lily, where he had been staying for 3 or 4 days. Libaeus Horden, 19 years of age, 5'11", medium build, dark complexion, skin inclined to be yellow, dark eyes, small face, no beard, whiskers or moustache, head always bent forward, good-looking English appearance, dressed when last seen in a grey Norfolk jacket, long trousers turned up at the bottoms and fashionable patent leather shoes, generally carries a camera with him, may go on a farm in the country. The police generally are directed to make special, quiet and discreet inquiry with a view to locating the missing youth. If traced, telegraph this office at once. The matter should be treated as confidential. 2 years later, on the 24th of October 1912, it announces the marriage of Labeus. On Thursday morning, the 17th of October, the wedding of Mr. Labeus Horden, son of Mr. Samuel Horden of Retford Hall, Darling Point, Mrs. Horden at present in London, and Miss Olga Clare, oldest daughter of Mr. and Mrs. William Money of Thornley, Concord. The ceremony took place in the sanctity of St. Mary's Cathedral. They had a son, Labeus Anthony Horden, in April 1914. On the 5th of April 1935, it says the Daily Express says that when Mr. Labeus Horden awoke in his London flat today, he automatically became a millionaire. Today is his 21st birthday, and he received 2 fortunes of almost £1 million sterling from his grandfather Samuel and his father, who died in Sydney 3 years ago. Since he was 18 years of age, young Horden had received £10,000 a year. His mother's married again and is now living in London. So just going back a bit, on the 8th of May 1924, it says the departure of Mrs. Labeus Horden for America by the Niagara today was a more or less close-guarded secret. She was to have sailed by the Tahiti almost 3 weeks ago but did not go. At the last moment, the news photographer caught her appearing at the railing. Her sister, Miss Money, was to her right. And on the 28th of May 1925, the reason for her secretive leaving of the country was high society divorce. Labeus Horden's wife sues for decree, ex-valet story of London episode. The suit for divorce brought by Mrs. Olga Clare Horden, née Money, against her husband, Mr. Labeus Horden, has occupied public interest for many months, and it came before the divorce court on last Wednesday. Neither petitioner or respondent nor the lady in the case appeared before the court. The wife's evidence was taken on commission in England, and the respondent did not file an answer to the charge. Evelyn Honoria Willis, the lady in the case, who is now Mrs. Brown, did not intervene. Mr. Justice Owen gave Mrs. Horden her liberty and the custody of the only child of the marriage, a son. Practically the only oral evidence presented was given by Edward Fitzgerald, a writer living at Darlinghurst, who, before and after the Horden wedding, was employed by Mr. Horden as his valet. He accompanied Mr. Horden to England, knew Mrs. Horden and was well acquainted with Miss Willis, and had seen her baby, alleged to have been fathered by the respondent. Mrs. Horden, before her marriage to Labeus Horden, merchant, was a well-known Sydney society girl. Before her marriage, she was Miss Money and her father was a contractor. She was born at Campbelltown in New South Wales. The respondent described himself as a bachelor of independent means. The couple after marriage lived at various places about Sydney until 1915, and one child, a boy, Labeus Anthony Horden, now 10 years old, was born. In her evidence, taken on commission and read by Mr. A.V. Maxwell, Mrs. Horden, now living in Paris, stated that after her marriage she resided with her husband at Burracar, Darling Point. In 1915 she accompanied him to England, where he joined the Royal Flying Corps, subsequently exchanging into the Royal Field Artillery. While he was thus engaged, she remained in England. When he was demobbed in 1918, she accompanied him on his return to Sydney. Before leaving England, there was trouble about a woman her husband went away with. They quarrelled over this woman, but after their return to Sydney, she forgave him and things went well until she found a letter from the woman. In that letter, the woman stated that she was in trouble, and that was in 1919. She asked her husband for an explanation and expressed a wish to know whether he intended to give up this woman. Horden replied that he would live his own life. "Very well," said his wife, "then I will leave." In June of that year, they agreed to a separation, and in August, Mrs. Horden packed up her belongings with her child and left for Europe. She's remained there since. About 2 years after her marriage, Mr. Horden lodged a petition in divorce against her, and in that petition he made certain charges, but they were not true. Seeing that he had no hope of succeeding, he dropped the suit. Mr. Horden had in his employ for some years a valet, Edward Fitzgerald, and this man came to see her and gave her certain information. This was after the suit her husband had started that had been abandoned. Acting on that information, she filed a petition for a dissolution in April 1924. Before that, she'd seen her husband in Sydney and had a conversation with him regarding a Miss Willis and a child, which at the time was 5 years old. Mr. Horden admitted that the child was his, and when the valet called upon her, he told her that all the time Mr. Horden was in London, he and Miss Willis and the child were with him. The council produced the birth certificate and registration of this child, a girl, Barbara Labeus Horden, born September 11th, 1919. The registration was in the name of Evelyn Honoria Willis, shop assistant, and the child was born at Mayfield House, Brixton, London. From these facts, Mrs. Horden gathered enough material to frame a charge of misconduct against her husband, and she particularised the following places and dates. Between the 1st of January 1920 and the 31st of March 1920, Labeus Horden committed misconduct with Evelyn Honoria Willis at the Savoy Hotel, London, Piccadilly Hotel, London, and at Brighton and elsewhere. Mr. Watt KC then called Edward Fitzgerald, a smart, alert, well-groomed young man whose shining hair was parted with meticulous care. He is an ex-valet, and he made it quite clear that he entertained no ill feeling against his late employer. In fact, only recently he received a letter from Mr. Horden asking him to return to his previous position. He'd parted with Mr. Horden on good terms and had been subpoenaed by C.P. White, Mrs. Horden's solicitor. Fitzgerald stated that he had been the valet to Mr. Horden for about 10 years. He was with him in England in 1915. In 1920, he had a talk with Mr. Horden, and as a result, they made a trip in a private car to Prescott Road, Brixton. There he saw Miss Willis and the child. The latter appeared to be about 1 or 2 years old. He told her that a gentleman from Australia wanted to see her. Her mother was present. He induced her to come to the Savoy Hotel where Mr. Horden was stopping. Her mother tried to dissuade her, and she did not appear to go too readily herself. But they went to the Savoy and arrived at 11 o'clock. She took the baby straight up to the suite occupied by Mr. Horden. She stopped there for 3 weeks, sharing Mr. Horden's room. Later, Mr. Horden, Miss Willis, the baby, and Miss Willis's sister went to Brighton, where they stayed at the Albion Hotel. The sister looked after the baby, and Miss Willis shared Horden's room, the sister and the baby occupying another double room. He found a house in Brighton for Miss Willis, and she was installed there by Mr. Horden. She stopped for 3 months when Mr. Horden engaged rooms at the Piccadilly Hotel, London, and Miss Willis and her sister and the boy went back to the mother's place at Brixton. When they saw Miss Willis, she had not much clothing, and Mr. Horden bought her some. She also visited him at the Piccadilly Hotel. Mr. Horden had been put out in a car with her and had held the baby, nursing it and dangling it on his knee, while Miss Willis was shopping inside. He amused the infant with toy balloons. Fitzgerald added that Mr. Horden had drawn his attention to the fact that the infant bore a striking resemblance to him and that he would like to get someone to adopt it. He was very much attached to the woman. He was present when Mr. Horden had made out a document arranging for a settlement for Miss Willis. Mr. Watt KC asked how did they used to address each other, and Fitzgerald said she used to call him Lebby or Billy, and he used to call her Eva. In her evidence, Mrs. Horden referred to a letter from Miss Willis, which she'd found addressed to her husband. The letter was read by His Honour. It will be noted that it was dated from number 2 Mayfield House, Rushcott Road, Brixton, where the baby was subsequently born 9 months to the day before that event. The letter was as follows. Dearest Billy, why did you go away like you did without even coming to say goodbye? There must be some reason. You know how things stood with me, and yet you go away and leave me alone and without a farthing, and you wouldn't let me know where you were going. I cannot understand why you told me you were going to Italy. Of course I believed it, and didn't even trouble you by writing to you while you were in London. Why didn't you come and meet me on the Tuesday? I suppose you didn't mean to meet me again. Oh, I can't think it is possible for you to go away like this without telling me you were going. I suppose you thought I was going to worry you. You know I never worried you at all. You surely couldn't have forgotten me, because you did once think a little bit, didn't you? You know how very fond I was of you, dear. I think I shall go mad with the thought that you are so many miles away. I have been in bed for more than a week, and the doctor says I'm too weak to do any work for quite a long time, and of course you know what that means to me. I haven't got any money, and I don't know what to do. I have had to part with my lovely ring you gave me. I live in the hopes of having it again. Please do write to me and cable me some money, because I haven't had a penny since you gave me the £10. I wonder if I shall see you again. I go to bed and think of you all night and day. I really think I shall die. I think it would be the best thing that could happen. You don't know how I miss you. I am too ill to go out and I never see anybody. You can just imagine how miserable I am, and especially after the glorious times you used to give me. I can't think it possible that you could have gone away without seeing me. What was the reason? Was it because Powell took me out? You know you asked him to do so. It wasn't with my wish. However, did you go to Australia right out of the army? I do not think there is anything more for me to say. I expect you are feeling slightly bored. Please do cable me some money as soon as possible, dear. Yours lovingly, Eva. P.S. I suppose you can guess what is the matter with me. Mother doesn't know, and I don't know what to do without any money because I cannot go away. E. I do not rely so much upon Mrs. Horden's evidence as I do upon that of the witness, Edward Fitzgerald, said His Honour. His testimony concerning the misconduct between Mr. Horden and Miss Willis is overwhelming and leaves no doubt whatsoever in my mind. His Honour recorded a decree nisi returnable in 6 months. He awarded the wife the custody of little Labaeus Anthony Horden, now being educated in Paris, and charged the costs against Mr. Horden. And it said that the court was crowded with this divorce case, with many prominent society women being present. Mrs. Horden is at present allowed £8,000 a year by the respondent. So Barbara Labaeus Horden Willis married twice and had 2 children, and she died in March 1994 in Surrey, aged 75. Olga Claire Horden, after her divorce from Labaeus, went on to marry Raphael de Romero at St. Philip del Roule in Paris on the 30th of September 1930. And on the 9th of November 1931, it says, weekend visitors at the Hotel Alexander included Sonora de Romero of Madrid, formerly Mrs. Labaeus Horden. She reached Melbourne on the East-West Express on Saturday and left for Sydney yesterday. Senor de Romero was attached to the Spanish embassy in Paris when he and Mrs. Horden married. Later, he was transferred to the Spanish embassy at Warsaw. When King Alfonso was dethroned, the Spanish royal embassies in various countries were transformed into republican embassies, and Senor de Romero was forced to relinquish his position. She's come to Australia on a business trip connected with the financial interests of herself and her son. And Olga died in 1973 in London, aged 80. And in February 1926, it says, Mr. Horden, whose divorce proceedings with his first wife were completed only a fortnight ago, has resigned from the firm of Anthony Horden and Sons of Sydney, and his intention is to travel extensively. In that same year, it was announced that Labaeus Horden and Miss Frances Barry of Sydney were quietly married in Adelaide on the return of Miss Barry from a visit to Europe. Miss Barry was Frances Mary Barry. She was 29 and Labaeus 34 when they married. They had a son, Peter Gerald Horden, who was born in 1926. And Labaeus Horden died on the 10th of September 1928 at Hopewood House, Darling Point, aged only 37. And the article related to his death says, Labaeus Horden was found dead in bed at his residence, Darling Point, this morning. Death is believed to be due to an overdose of a sedative. The deceased suffered considerably from nervous troubles and insomnia. He was one of the largest shareholders in the company of Anthony Horden and Son. He was well known in the business world, not only in Australia but overseas. He was one of the leaders and pioneers of aviation in Australia and spent considerable sums of money in advancing the interests of flying. He made a personal gift of £5,000 to Kingsford Smith and Ulm after the Trans-Pacific flight. He was also a keen motor yachtsman. He received much of his early education in England. He returned at 19 years old and became associated with Anthony Horden and Sons, and for a time occupied a seat on the board of directors. At the outbreak of war, he went to England and enlisted in an English regiment, with which he sought service in France. He was gassed in action and finally invalidated home to Australia in 1917. Apart from his interests in the city, he was for a time the owner of the stations Tooree and Castellan, and also purchased a country home in Bowral. And on the 17th of March 1929, widespread interest has been occasioned by the claim for £10,000 from the estate of the late Mr. Labaeus Horden by Miss Maud Shilvers of Darling Point for, as alleged, work done as deceased's confidential secretary at various times. The declaration alleges that the late Mr. Horden promised to marry the plaintiff should she continue as his confidential secretary, and in the meantime he would make his will, in which it was further alleged he promised to provide for her in the event of his dying before the alleged promise of marriage was carried out. So Labaeus Horden seemed to be a very complicated young man. In part 3, I'll be covering the remaining children of Anthony Horden Sr.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.